Okay, with your quorum, it's time's up. And welcome to the Bills Committee on the Inland Revenue Amendment Number 7, Bill 2017. According to the RRP election procedures, and please nominate for the election candidates for the election of the chairman. And the nomination had to be seconded by another member and accepted by the nominated member. Nominations, please. Mr. Chen Chen-ying, I nominate Mr. Holden Chow. Would you accept? Yes. So anyone to second? 2 members. Mr. Leung Kai-cheong. And one other. Any other nominations? So I just count to 3. 1, 2, 3. No other nominations.
Oh，係咪要開？哦，好，問咗大家先。各位好快一條問題。
Okay, quick question. Do you need to elect a deputy chairman? If not, then we can forgo that. So can we invite the government's reps into the room? Let me introduce the government vice president, Mr. Andrew Lai, Deputy Secretary Treasury of the Financial Services and Treasury Bureau, and Mr. Chiu Kwok-kit, Deputy Commissioner Technical of the Inland Revenue Department, and Ms. Perkvin Young, Principal Assistant Secretary Treasury, Financial Services and Treasury Bureau, and Mr. Manuel Ng, Senior Government Counsel of the DOJ, and Ms. Chen Sun-mei, Senior Assessor of the IRD. And can the administration walk us through this bill and then invite questions from members? Morning, members. And thank you for coming to the scrutiny of the Bills Committee of the IR Amendment Number 7. This responded to the CE election manifesto in reducing the profit tax from 16.5% to 8.25% and 75% respectively. We hope to commence this change as soon as possible. This is first proposed in the CE election manifesto. The original proposal is to reduce the profit tax of the assessed profit for the first 2 million from 16.5% to 15%. After a few months of deliberation, the tax rate decided will be 16.5 to 8.25 or 7.5%, which is the half of the current standard tax rate. We hope to reduce the tax expenditure of the corporation, so devote more resources on the upgrading of hard software as well as training of the staff. So that should enhance the competitiveness of Hong Kong, and this will also promote Hong Kong as an investment destination. This will serve as a selling point as well. And for this, amendment proposals are relatively straightforward. We're simply reducing the tax rate. It was an incorporation for the first 2 million, as stated in the paragraph 4, from 16.5 at present to 8.25. For the after 2 million, there will be tax for the rate of 16.5. For the unincorporated business, for the sole proprietorship or partnerships, currently the tax rate is at 15%. And after this amendment bill has been enacted, for the first 2 million assessable profit, the tax rate will be 7.5%, and over 2 million, it will be 15%. And for paragraph 6, we mentioned about the implementation details, mainly the 2 items. We're hopeful the easy for the private sector to adopt and understand. So usually you have 2 conditions. Currently, the IRO have offered a preferential half tax rate. For example, airport leasing companies, corporate treasury centers, and professional reinsurance companies and captive insurance companies. Under the IRO, they have been enjoying the preferential tax rate of 8.25%. In order to avoid a double benefit, they could only choose one out of 2. Either they would adopt the 8.25%, or they take part of this 2-tier system. And under the IRO, those are engaging in qualifying debt instruments, and for the interest gain or profit, they are enjoying this preferential half tax rate. And these income are major form part of the proceeds from these sort of companies. And when the IRD assessing the tax for these companies, for the profit of the qualifying tax instrument, the tax rate will be halved. And for the other proceeds, they will still enjoy the 2-tier system. So we could actually get to examine the provision in the clause-by-clause phase. And for the operation arrangement, the Chief Executive, whether in her election manifesto or in a policy address, mentioned that for the 2-tier regime, the consideration is to assist the small and medium enterprises in Hong Kong. In line with this spirit, for those connected entities or persons, we only allow them to nominate one entity to enjoy this 2-tier system. And let's say a group of companies own 10 companies, which there are each one enjoy a few million profits. They can only nominate one company to entitle for this 2 tiers. On one hand, make sure that the tax concession is focused for the SMEs. And when calculating the loss of tax revenue, we can provide a more accurate estimate. And going along with our proposal, and for the corporations and the UBs, let's say 20% of those connected entities would only nominate one company to enjoy this 2-tier tax regime. The loss of tax revenues is about 5.8 billion. Look at the previous financial year of 2016-17, the total revenue is 139 billion, so accounting about 4%. So in terms of financial impact, we think it will be acceptable. I hope that the members will support this amendment bill. And once it's passed by LegCo, hopefully we can be implemented for the 2018 to 19 accessible year. So if there's any questions, the RD and my colleagues are glad to respond to any inquiries. And thank the government representatives. Before questioning, if members have any direct or indirect pecuniary interests on the matter of discussion, and the member should disclose the relevant interest before he or she speaks. I shall open the floor for his first round questioning for 5 minutes with Q&A. Those who put up your hand, Mr. Kenneth Leung, Mr. Yu Shi Wing, Starry Lee. So first is Mr. Kenneth Leung. First question. Can you provide a figure? So once this two-tier system is implemented, so what's the loss of the taxation revenue? So I see there's a anti-avoidance on 14 AAB. So within the corporate structure, only one company within the group companies can enjoy this two-tier system. For UBs, they can either in partnership or sole proprietorships to operate a business. See at 114 AAB, item C, to avoiding different entities entitled to this and only allow that natural person to enjoy this preferential rate once. However, if it serves as a partnership in different business, in so many businesses, is there any effective mechanism to prevent this two-tier tax regime from being abused? Government rep, please. Thank you to Mr. Leung's question. Our tentative estimate was that once these two-tiered rates are implemented, let's say the connected entities would account for about 20% of the accessible profit. The loss of tax revenue is about 5.8 billion. So it's only based on the year 2015-16 year assessment tax receipts, or the over $1,100,000 companies about 23,000 UBs had paid their taxes. So we made this estimate on the basis of the number of companies, and if there is a change, the economic situation will also affect our tax receipts. So for the 14 AAB, for the tax avoidance provisions, so I will let Mr. Chu to explain. Thank you, Mr. Chu. So respond to Mr. Leung's question. So let me explain the legislative intent. I hope to strike a balance that this preferential tax rate can be easily understood in the business sector and easily executed. That there will be a clear definition of which companies will be enjoy this two-tier tax rate. So we define it on the control of 50%. Why do we set as 50%? Because practically speaking, if say a company controlled over another, that will be count as connected entity. Let's say a natural person have a sole proprietorship, at the same time, he also has a certain interest in partnership A and B. Under our system, partnership A and B is not regarded as a connected entity to the natural person unless these partnership interests are over 50% at over A and B. I would follow up. So there's no control but rather distribution profit in those partnerships. So when you look at the distribution of profits to see how a natural person control interest, let's say the distribution profit is 70 to 30%. However, in the contract, I'll just stipulate the control would go to the smaller partner. So in this kind of situations, it is hard to define who has to control.
Mr. Chiu, maybe I can supplement. Under 14AA(b) bracket 4, it has explained what I mentioned just now. That is about the control. The meaning of control is that, well, if it's a partner and he owns over 50% or more of the share interest. Yes, thank you. Next, Mr. Yu Siwing. Thank you, Chairman. I would like to declare interest first. Our company may benefit from this new two-tier regime. I, of course, support this tax relief because for SMEs, if they pay less tax, they can operate more efficiently. So this is a good policy. And I would like to ask a question. Now, if a company is under a group, then if it's less than 50%, then you don't have to consider whether it's included, right? Yes, Mr. Yu's understanding is correct. So if it's less than 50%, then it will be regarded as an individual company, and it can apply for this tax reduction, right? Now, if that's an entity, it has its own business, and that's another entity, and if the other entity's interest or control is less than 50%, then they're not connected. But however, if another person has over 50%, then that person will be connected to this entity. And for paragraph 12 of your paper, you are saying that the tax revenue will be $5.8 billion yet per year. So, but the companies can make use of their saved tax by investing in hardware or software, right? So this is just your guess, right? You do not provide them with other tax reductions, right? Mr. Chiu? Yes, Mr. Yu is right. Now we are reducing the tax, and the saved tax will be kept by the company, and the company can use the money in whatever way it likes. So there are no extra requirements. No, thank you. Thoroughly, Chairman. For SMEs, if their cost of operation can be reduced, I would welcome that. Now you are saying that under a group, they can nominate one company to enjoy the lower tax rate. But as we all know, in Hong Kong, there is a business with a huge profit that is collecting rents. And some people will buy properties in the name of companies. So for these companies, unless they are related to a group, I think they can all enjoy this lower rate. So if it's a group, when it buys a property, the company that buys the property can be not included under the group. Now the threshold is set at 50%, right? So all these companies will be able to enjoy the cut. So there is this kind of business, right? Buying properties and enjoying the income from rents. Yes, I'll try to answer this question. Well, for a group or a listed group, it's very clear that is all the rent collecting companies will be under this group. Now, supposedly, if that's an individual, he has 10 properties, and each property is held by one company. Now, under the present law, because all these companies are held by one individual, so these companies are all connected. So only one company can enjoy the two-tier regime. Oh, let me clarify. Yes, I understand about group. Now, for ordinary group arrangements, well, they can only choose one of the companies to enjoy the two-tier regime. But with this new arrangement, if this group buys a new property, it doesn't include the property holding company under the group, then you won't find it out, right? Because you will look at the holding threshold of 50%. Let me try to explain from another perspective. Of course, that company or certain individuals, as to how they invest in properties, is their own commercial decision. But since the end of 2012, the buyer stamp duty has been implemented. So if you buy a property by a company, the stamp duty is 15%. So the government has other policies to handle this issue, that is using companies' names to buy properties. So this is about the stamp duty arrangements. Okay, back to what we said just now. Say that's an individual. He has 10 properties which are held by 10 different companies. So these 10 companies are independent. So they would all enjoy the 8.25% tax rate, or just one? Or for these 10 companies, because they are controlled by the same natural person, so they are connected. Yes, let me supplement. The principle is very simple. All connected entities can only nominate one company to enjoy this half tax rate for the first $2 million. So no matter what business it is, whether it's property investment or running a company, it's all the same. It's about connected entities. Yes, I understand that. I'm talking about individuals. Now, individuals and groups are different. The concepts are different. I am an individual. I have 10 companies. I am one of the shareholders. And I may own some of the companies wholly, and for some other companies, I own more than 10% or less than, own more than 50% or less than 50%. So this is about individuals and groups. So if there's only one owner, then only one nomination can be made. I have a follow-up question. Maybe later on I'll ask my questions. Next, Mr. Ray Chen. Thank you, Chairman. Well, the People's Power has always promoted progressive tax rate. That is, if you gain more money, you would have to pay over 15%. So it's very difficult for us to support this two-tier regime. Well, the government says the two-tier regime will gain international publicity mileage in promoting Hong Kong as a preferred investment destination. Now, this is quite exaggerated. Do you have data to support this? Why do you think that after implementing this policy, Hong Kong will be the preferred investment destination? Well, companies are very good at evading tax, no matter whether it's property stamp duties or profits tax. Now you are reducing tax to enhance competitiveness is very difficult. Well, so for some other countries, they can even lower their profits rate to zero in order to attract investors. In the future meetings, I hope that the government can provide us with this information. That is, in other countries, what are their latest profits tax rates? Have some countries reduced their tax rates lately, and now you are setting the assessable profit level at $2 million. Why that figure? Now you have changed the tax regime, so in the near future, will you further lower the rates? Now you divided it into 2 tiers. You are not initiating a major change. So I hope the government will provide me with data. That is, after implementing this 2-tier regime, the tax base won't be narrowed and the wealth gap won't be widened. Thank you for your question. Well, let me talk about the international situation. In the last 1 or 2 years, it seems that tax reduction has been an international trend. Now for Hong Kong, the tax rate is 16.5%. We are already very competitive. It's one of the lowest in the world. Well, for this advantage, it's now shrinking. If we look at the U.S., they have a major change. Their profits tax rate has been reduced from 35% to 21%, and the UK has reduced it to 18%. So this is the international trend. Mr. Ray Chen is very concerned about a point. That is, after the tax reduction, will there be more tax evasions? Well, yesterday we had another IR bill meeting here, and OECD is launching another policy. Is about anti-tax evasion. That is about the BEPS action plan. So it is another policy to tackle tax evasion. So through international tax cooperations, different jurisdictions will be implementing new measures concerning multinational companies. And it will be more and more difficult for corporations to evade tax. Many countries are now promoting taxation transparency and equity. So for EU and other developed and developing companies have taken part in this. So this should help suppress tax evasion. Mr. Ray Chen asked, for this 2-tier regime, whether Hong Kong's tax base will be narrowed and will there be inequality? Well, the answer is no, because we are just looking at the tax rate, and it's just for the first $2 million of accessible profits. As for the range of profits tax, that has not been changed, so the tax base is still the same. Well, for the companies which have to pay tax for their first 2 million of gains, they just need to pay less tax. So this is more or less like a progressive system. If a small restaurant is making $2 million a year in the past, it had to pay 16.5%, just like other big consortia. But with this 2-tier regime, so for companies of all sizes, they just have to pay 8.25% of tax for their first $2 million profits. Now you're going to reduce the tax. Do you have a plan to reduce other tax rates in the future? No, at the moment we do not have such a plan. And then I'll ask my questions. I would like to follow up on Starry Lee's questions. Well, supposedly there's an individual, he has 15 companies, and all these companies would buy their properties, and they are all charging rents. And as you said just now, even so, for these 15 companies, you can only choose one to enjoy the tax benefits, right? Well, this is just hypothetical. If somebody wants to play a trick, it wants to make use of this regime to enjoy more tax reduction. But you can still monitor that, right? You can ensure that you can check all the relevant data, right?
So for the technical details, I can give a brief overview because the legal advisor in her letter have raised this issue as well. So in the tax returns, the taxpayer will have to point out that I wish to choose the 2-tier profit tax. If they choose so, they have to state that they had no connected entities or no other connected entities apply for this lowered rate. So that will state in the declaration that has no other connected entities or the only one connected entities applying for the lower rate. That's the first step. So if they provide false information on tax returns or makes false declaration, they have civil and criminal consequences. As for the chairman's question, do we have a review of this? Yes. So for the regime, well, frankly, we're still at design stage. We can do this in several ways. For the high-risk ones, we will definitely take a look. Let's say the group of companies are quite famous, so we have all the information. It's quite easy to check. For the unlisted companies, let's say we can do some random sampling or to review some cases to see whether there are breaches. If so, whether they are intentional, then see how do we handle them. So that was the idea. Thank you. I have another question. So for this 2-tier tax rate is based on the assessable profit. However, there's probably no requirement on the head counts. Let's say I've hired 5 people. I'm hiring 200 people, even though they make the 2 million profit, there's still the same treatment. So have you taken into consideration of the manpower? So maybe there's some other questions. Let's say I made under 2 million. However, I've been hiring 50 or 100 people. So does that mean that I should be more eligible for this tax concession, which serves of a kind of incentive to create more jobs? Just a question from TsyB. Have you actually considered that? Okay, Chairman, thank you for your question. So when designing this regime, we hope that it could be easily understood and straightforward, where the business sector can implement easily. So we take the 2 million and halving tax rate as the core. For the connected entities, if they're not connected, our message is clear. Regardless of the business nature, the size, as long as they're eligible, the first 2 million of assessable profit can enjoy this half the tax rate. So that's the end of the question. We have 2 other members for the first round of questioning. Mr. Kwok Wei Kang. Morning, Chairman. For this 2-tiered rates, I generally support it as if the business or the boss do a good job, hopefully they could benefit the employees rather for improving their remuneration and benefits. However, I must point out that every time when requesting for the improving the welfare of the staff, very often they cite the SME as some sort of a shield. So for the those under 2 million in profit, their tax rate will be halved. So they'll be able to save about 100,000 in tax. So hopefully, in improving the employee welfare, there will be measures in place so that the staff can share the benefit as well. So besides those who made under 2 million in profits and entitled for a tax reduction, the FTU had always advocated for a fair and straightforward tax regime. Would you consider raising the tax rate for a company with a profit of a certain size? Would you consider adding 1 extra percent so that they could have more resources for welfare and so on? I hope the department can respond. So after halving the tax rate of those under 2 million profits, these do you have a comparison of the competitiveness of these SMEs to other countries, so as to convince us that this tax reduction will not only benefit SMEs, can also attract foreign capital to Hong Kong? So what is the rationale behind this? Deputy Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Kwok's question. As for any room to raising a tax rate for a company of a certain profit size in this international landscape, a lot of countries are already reducing their corporate tax rate. For the U.S., they just announced of reducing from 35 to 21%, and the U.K. will reduce from 19 to 17%. And Japan have announced that the corporate tax rate will be reduced from, in 2026, 24.5% to 23.2%. So a lot of countries have been reducing taxes to enhance their competitiveness as well to attract foreign capital. So when it's setting our tax rate, we have to take into account our competitiveness at the international landscape. And for this proposed arrangement, we consider appropriate. As property tax is the biggest source of income for the Hong Kong government, that we talk about a minor impact. We talk about 5.8 billion of lost tax receipts. And for this current proposal, whether for SMEs, for companies below, with profit below 2 million, there will be a greatest benefit. So we hope that when the company do well, the staff will benefit as well. And for the SME competitiveness, we think that the tax rate is only one of the factors. Of course, you can say our cost of doing business and the labor costs and the productivity and so on, these are relevant as well. If we want to enhance the SME competitiveness, we only not rely on the tax policy. I hope members should understand that whether the CSFB as well the Trade and Industry Department have also launched a lot of schemes to support the SMEs. Next, Mr. Felix Chung Kwok Pan. First round. And this two-tier tax rate reduced to 8.25, and we support that, so they absolutely benefit to the. I must declare that I'm a businessman, and my companies may benefit under this new policy. I would like to ask the Deputy Secretary, where do we draw the line? So, I mean, is that, let's say, two companies, and they have the same shareholders. So those less than 50%, that means that the loss of ownership shares. So does that mean the A and B will not be connected entities? So after this is implemented, they have a transfer of shares to reduce the ownership shares to below 50%. So do we not disallow this so that to make the company not a connected entities in order to benefit for this lower tax rate?
好，唔該。
我明白。
I understand Mr. Chung's question. So, change of ownership structure will happen, of course. So I'll let Mr. Chu already to explain. So for Mr. Chung Kwok-Pen's question, just I can give a brief, simple reply. So our design or the connected entities, we used a 50% as the threshold for the profit distribution and ownership. This is simply understood and easy to operate. If a company has a less than 50% interest in a company, they would not regard as a connected entity. So there will be both companies can be entitled to this tiered rates. Let's say what happened was a transfer ownership. So it's just a normal business activity, and therefore they're not involved of any tax evasion or potential breaches. Of course, this business behavior have consequences beyond giving up your interest and profit and gains. So they will not. So the former shareholder will not be entitled to such. I see members or Mr. Lang Kei-cheng will have second round questioning. I would like to urge you to clarify that for those who are enjoying the preferential tax rate, let's say the CTC or insurance company, would they be ineligible for this? Because they're paying half anyway, not be half of half, right? So Mr. Kenneth Leung's understanding is correct. Second round, Mr. Lee. What I said may not be relevant to today's discussion. So now you have to create these two rates to reduce the SME burden. I support this, and you point out that internationally, if you hope to increase the tax rate, probably not feasible in view of our financial situation. The DAB has been asking for more concession measures for the middle classes. So now that the two-tier system is launched, another one, the biggest burden will be the middle class. I know there's two different tax systems. However, those paying salary tax and profit tax probably not a sharp delineation. In some situation, they can choose pay either way. But however, those paying salary tax, especially those high income ones, we have a biggest tax burden, because under the property tax regime, there are a lot of tax deduction items, and whatever excessive profit entitled for a lower tax rate. However, for the middle class, there are not much deductions other than the basic deductions for couples, as well as for deductions for children. So we'll be asking for tax deduction for domestic helper, which were not granted, as well as deduction for basic expenditure. I understand this decision made by the Finance Secretary. However, I would like to listen to your views on this. So after the two rates implemented, the tax burden of the high-income middle classes will become higher. Of course, you're just the execution department. Would you see that? Would there any room for reducing the tax for this high-income middle class? Thank you, Ms. Starley's question. in comments. So after they have had implement this two-tiered rates and these salary tax, we believe on the principle of equity and richer will pay more. So I think those who could and should pay more would manifest the spirit. So after this time, we see some views that for those high-income earners paying salary tax, and whether there will be some sort of corresponding measures. So we can study that in other revenues. So let's deal with this SME concessions first.
Well, you have always said that we should attach importance to equality. I don't think that's Hong Kong's tax regime advantages. Now, our advantages are that we have a low and simple tax regime. So it's not about equality, but if of course we can adopt other methods to make sure that things are more equal. But for Hong Kong's taxation regime, I don't think it's about fairness. So for changes to our taxation regimes, I think you should pay more attention to equality. And there are a lot of issues that we should ponder over. Now, for the buying of properties, if you buy a property in the capacity of a company or in the capacity of an individual, the differences are getting bigger and bigger. So according to these arrangements, I can enjoy a lower tax rate if I buy a property in the name of a company. But if I buy it as an individual, I do not enjoy any benefits. So don't you think that this problems will arise? As to how a person should invest, it's a personal choice. But your taxation regime has created huge differences. Well, a person would have to consider different risks, because if you open a company, you need to make certain payments. So I think it's up to each individual's decision. As I said just now, under the present stamp duty ordinance, if you use a company's name to buy a residential property, you have to pay 15% stamp duty. Mr. Chen Zhenying. Thank you, Chairman. I know that for this two-tier regime, you want SMEs to benefit, and you want to make it simple and straightforward. Now, a simple way of doing it may be like this. Now, I've read your paper. You say that there are 23,900 corporations that have accessible profits above $2 million. Now, you can look at the turnover of this 23,900 enterprises, because you would ask them to fill in such details in their tax returns. So these enterprises will be excluded from the two-tier regime, and after doing that, the SMEs can really benefit. So when you formulate the policy, have you thought about this exclusion approach? That is, only SMEs will benefit, and big corporations would not be included. Now I have to declare interest as well, because I serve at a banking corporation, and it may be able to enjoy these tax benefits. And I am also working for a bank association, and I'm sure it will also benefit. Now, for Mr. Chan's considerations, yes, when we put together this two-tier system, we have thought about that. We want to make the regime simple and straightforward. Now, for IRD, when it assess profits tax, the major things it look at are profits. So if we have to look at the turnover, this would be something new, and it may not be applicable to all the companies because we have to look at different trades. Now, for some company or some trades, they have their own characteristics of turnover. So looking at profits is much simpler. Now, for profits, different companies would have different levels of profits. So if we use $2 million as the line, then if companies make more than $2 million, if they make a lot of profits this year, then only the first $2 million will benefit. But if they make less than $2 million, then they will pay less tax. So there is a flexibility. That is, under the profits tax regime, we would target only on profits. Is that really? Well, I work for a company which provides tax consultancy service. So I think my company's service may be related to this bill, but I personally am not engaged in this kind of business. Second round, Kwok Wai-Kang. Thank you, Chairman. Now, for this tax reduction measure in the short term, of course, is acceptable to a lot of people, but I want to look at it more long term. Now, in the short term, because now the government is getting a lot of revenues through stamp duties. So if it has less revenue from profits tax, that should be acceptable. But what about in 50 years' time, if the government's not getting so much revenue from stamp duty, but it has reduced profits tax? So would the pressure on the tax base be increased, and would such a burden be shifted onto employees? Mr. Kwok asked about stamp duty and tax base. Well, for stamp duty, well, it's related to property transactions and the share market, etc. Yes, it can be very volatile. This is not a very stable source of revenue. So that's exactly why we need a stable revenue source. Profits tax has all along been the biggest source of income for the Hong Kong government. If major changes are made, we have to be really prudent. So this time around, we are just fine-tuning it. That is, it's just about the first $1 million of accessible profits. In the long run, whether our taxation regime will be changed and whether the tax base will be changed, etc. The FS mentioned this last year. He said that a tax policy unit will be set up. In the long run, it will look at the broadening of tax base, and it will try to find out more revenue sources for the government. So we will focus on Hong Kong's economic growth and a diversified economic development. Well, Chairman, that is a bit frightening. Now you are reducing profits tax, but at the same time you are looking at expanding the tax base. So that means there will be more pressure on salaries tax, and there may be adjustment to that. So I have another question. For this tax reduction measure, would there be an abolishment mechanism? That is, if the tax revenue has fallen to a certain level, then the profits tax rate would be reinstated. Well, because for benefits like this, when you give them to people, of course, they would welcome it, but it's very difficult to undo it. There will be another pressure. So can you answer this question? So can it be undone? Mr. Kwok, maybe I didn't make myself clear, so that's why there is this misunderstanding. Now, for our taxation policy, the most important thing is to make use of a good taxation policy so that Hong Kong's economy can grow and in a sustainable manner. So now for this first $2 million, the tax rate will be lowered. Now this will enhance SME's competitiveness. Just now, you stressed that short-term goals can be attained because you want to attract more investors and more jobs to be created. But these are long-term policies, unless you tell me there is a time limit to this policy. So what are the long-term goals? Well, for short-term goals, this is the short-term work of the tax policy unit. Mr. Kwok is right. For this policy, it will be a long-term measure until both the government and the LegCo think there is a need to change. As for expanding the tax base, that's for the medium and long-term planning of the government. But this is not some work that we will kick off within a short period of time, because financially Hong Kong is very robust right now. Well, I would have to declare interest as well. Well, I work for a law firm which may benefit from this two-tier regime. Third round, Kenneth Leung. Before you speak, can you allow me to say this? Our legal advisor has sent a letter to the administration, and there are some questions for the government. Now, for this letter, it has already been issued, but of course it will take the government some time to reply. Now, let me ask our legal advisor to brief members on the letter first. Thank you. Now, for this letter, the number is CB bracket 1513718 bracket 01. It was issued yesterday. And there are 6 questions in it. When I listened to the government just now, it seems that when we do the clause-by-clause examination, some of these questions will be discussed. As for the major directions, I would like to ask about question 3 to 5. Question 3. Please clarify if it is the legislative intent to allow only one of 2 corporations which are connected entities defined under the proposed section 14A(a)(b) of Cap 112. For example, if I wholly own these 2 companies, but their combined profits are less than $2 million. So can I choose only one? That is, only one can benefit from the proposed lower profits tax rate. Government? The answer is yes. If there are 2 companies, then, well, if he's the major shareholders of these 2 companies, that is, owns more than 50%, then only one corporation can be nominated. Now, this is an example of, say, for one company, one company is a florist and the other is a noodle restaurant, and they each make $800,000. So in total, 1.6 million in profits. And another company is selling toys, and the profits is just less than 2 million. So for that toy company, it can enjoy all the tax benefits. However, for the other person who's operating 2 companies, that is for the florist and the noodle company, and each making $100,000, he can only choose one to enjoy the benefits. Now, if I choose the florist, then how about the noodle restaurant? The noodle restaurants cannot be entitled to any benefits. So the legal advisor asked this question in his letter. If I have two companies, then eventually I can choose only one to enjoy the tax benefits. And at the end of the day, I have to pay more. If I just have one company, then I would enjoy more tax benefits. But the profits are more or less the same. So if I operate two companies, I would have to pay more tax. So this is the question put forward by the legal advisor. So what's your consideration in this area? Or are you going to do it like what you said just now? Well, Chairman, for first $2 million and half rates, they are applicable to all companies. For connected entities, they can only nominate one company to receive the benefits. And there are two considerations. First, this is to mainly benefit SMEs.
So that do they have an excuse or pretext for the companies so that they would set up new companies to distribute their profit so that they can enjoy these concessions inappropriately. So we have this abuse prevention consideration already. So, legal advisor, anything to add? I want to clarify with the Bureau. Let's say I made less money than you, yet I can pay more in taxes. Can you answer yes? So would this happen? So citing his example, so there's one flower shop company and one business company, and they're making 0.8 million each, and together be 1.6 million in profits. So if it owns one company, one toy company, 2 million. So let's say for this 2 million profit business, they paid less taxes than this two business. So that will lead to this situation, right? So you do the math, you can have different scenarios. However, in practice, we can look at the intent. So we're actually making a simple initiative that to reduce the tax for the first 2 million applicable to all enterprises. I hope that we can actually make sure that it fulfills the intent of the focus the concession to the SMEs as well as having the and tax avoidance invention. So maybe I will defer to Mr. Chiu to comment on individual cases. So what's Mr. Chiu's views on this? So legal advisor raised an important point. When defining the connected entities, we need to draw a simple line that's easily executed and understood. That is the 50%, or where the distribution profit is over 50%. For the legal advisor example, there's actually a simplified example to highlight a particular point. So let's say corporation F or N, an example. So they could have a different accounting year. One could end in June, one could end in October. So we talk about profit tax here, but please don't remember, we still have the provisional profit tax looking into next year's profit. So will they still make the same amount of profit next year? The presumption was that we need to be easy to execute and to implement. So looking at the legal advisor example, they're using as a residence. So if the Hong Kong resident in the example is a corporation, that probably will not be that unacceptable. So the legal advisor has provided some food for thought. However, the line we've drawn have turned into manufacturers in the account. Since the government reps had a legal advisor's letter table, so maybe we'd like a written response from you. For the third round, those put up their hand, Mr. Kenneth Leung. So I'd like to ask about a special scenario, or actually it could be quite common. So let's say a company have carried over 2 million in loss, and this year it has 5 million of accessible profit. So I don't have much time to work out. So under this two-tier system, the company can arrange and to apply its losses so that in the next few years they can minimize its tax bill. I wonder, under this amendment, would you allow this loss to be distributed across a few years, or we have to make sure that the loss can be offset within a year? Because under this two-tier system, you create this room for these companies to have such taxation arrangements. I wonder, have we looked into the application of loss, or rather they have to be offset this 2 million of losses against this 5 million on profit? That's my question. Mr. Chair, IRD. So we took that into account of Mr. Leung's concern. The accessible profit must deduct the carried over loss on the schedule of the property tax calculation. When calculating the accessible profit, make sure that the loss carried over the previous year assessment. So our view is that the taxpayer cannot have the choice of not to offset the carried over losses. Any other questions from members? We do. Mr. Wu Chi-wei. I think the current amendment, so let's say we're moving from a single tier to a two-tier system for the property tax regime. So reducing the tax rate to the first 2 million, so naturally there will be less tax receipts. The Democratic Party have been suggesting to the government, as this is a starting point, would you consider a progressive system for the profit tax like a salary tax? Let's say for 2 million, reduce to 8.25%. Of course, that will suit the needs of the SMEs. If you have 10 million in profit, you can have a slight reduction of over 10 million. You can have a higher tax rate, so that the math is even out. How the government consider this? Well, this is probably nothing new or new ideas per se. The Democratic Party in the past few budgets have pointed this out. Has the government has studied these proposals, and since for the loss of tax revenues, so how can you offset the loss of revenue? Our estimate is that the loss of tax receipt about 5.8 billion. So compared to the 140 billion of property tax revenue, talk about 4% only. So we think it's acceptable, and we take the long-term view. if the companies have a lot of capital and the company willing to reinvest, will train the manpower, and there will be more profits. And I think we have increasing tax revenue in the medium to long haul. Since there will be increasing productivity, of course, this is just a presumption. Let's say for a loss of 4% in tax receipts, we think acceptable. As for Mr. Wu's views on whether we can introduce a progressive system for its profit tax, so I explained to other members that internationally tax reduction is a major trend, and the UK and the US have reduced to either to 80% or 21%, and currently the 16.5% rate, even though we still have an edge. However, our competitive edge has shrinked. If we were to adjust our tax rate, we need to see the necessity as the impact of public finances. The property tax is still the biggest single source of tax receipts, so we need to balance different interests. So, following up on the Assistant Secretary response, we still ask for a tax cut. So let's say below 10 million. So even just to a small extent, it's still encouraging. For over 10 million, as we all take it that if a corporate profit over 10 million, it could be doing quite good and probably had the ability to pay more. So the spirit of the tax system that those could afford should pay more. And please don't forget that past study has suggested those with higher profit tax, their actual tax rate would actually quite low. I wonder if the government have such figures at hand. However, study had pointed out that the tax rate usually about 10 to 12% for the actual tax rate. When I'll take into account all these tax concessions by the government, the actual tax rate is about 10 to 12 out of its total profit. If such, the bill itself don't address these issues. However, as a policy, shouldn't we take a look? I want to see this supply side economics can assist more SMEs, and the SMEs have all agreed that those under 10 million profits are predominantly SMEs, or would it be able to realize government objectives through this tax regime? Thank you for Mr. Wu's question. And for the first 2 million tax rate, which took care of the huge majority of SMEs. So last year, the RD issued about over 200,000 SMEs, and about 100,000 would pay taxes. About 82,000, their profits is below 2 million. So this is what our two-tier system hope to target. And our proposed arrangements and for the numerous low-profit SMEs, there will be more effective and focused assistance. For the larger companies, whether we can charge them more higher taxes or whether they'll be paying less tax at all. For the big companies, so we see the trend of tax cuts around the world. So whether it will be just having a higher tax rate for them, we have to take into account the impact of Hong Kong and our competitiveness. Last night, the LegCo convened another Inland Revenue Bill Committee, And last time we talked about the avoidance of tax racial tax base. So we can conduct tax cooperation to target cross border conglomerate and to reduce the tax expenditure through different arrangements into putting their profit into less economic active countries. And through this BEPS program, we think that it should assist or benefit. So there will be less of a concern in the future.
So these issues have been discussed in another BC meeting. So after that bill is passed, then the effective tax rate will be significantly improved, right? Is that what you mean? Well, in simple terms, if the OECD, well, for the BEPS plan, over 130 countries are taking part. So if all these countries comply with the rules, then the multinational companies would have to submit their reports properly, and there will be much more difficulties for tax evasion. Well, I've been listening to Mr. Wu Chiwai's question. For BEPS scheme, will you rely on individual reports, and it's a global action? So that would only target big corporations. Now they are trying to evade tax in different countries. So BEPS will be effective for that purpose. But if BEPS can achieve what Mr. Wu said just now, that's questionable. Well, actually, this two-tier regime is pretty simple, so I'm not talking about this. I want to talk to the government about the overall profits tax policy. Yes, you told us that there is this international trend of tax reduction, and there is this BEPS action. And now you are focusing on the first $2 million. I think a lot of people would welcome it. But for companies which are making between $2 to $10 million, maybe the government should think about these companies. Now, this is the international trend. So shouldn't we adopt a progressive scale to handle profits tax? I think that's quite reasonable. Now, you can create room for these companies, and you can also set standards for tax reduction. And also for salaries tax, it has already adopted a progressive approach. So you can do that for salaries tax. Why can't you do it for profits tax? Because by doing so, we can encourage SMEs as well. So I hope the government would consider it. Try to find out whether it's feasible. Now, you may need more data for analysis, and then we can explore further in the future. I think the Deputy Secretary has heard you. Mr. Porcher, Chairman. Well, tax reduction can help the middle class. All along, I have been promoting this. But we have to look at this present method, whether it is the most appropriate one. I'm sorry, I was attending other meetings just now. I don't know whether this questions have been asked about public consultation and the commission. Well, there's no public consultation, and I think you haven't talked to the relevant panel first. So it seems that it's quite a rush. But of course, this is in the CE's manifesto. So will you do consultation? And for the policy interns, you are saying that this is an international trend. Every country is reducing tax, so we should also do that. And some other members have also said that this will benefit SMEs. So actually, which one is your policy intent? So for companies, they may save up to $165,000, and for UBs, $1,050,000. Well, this would not attract international consortia to come to Hong Kong. The legal advisor has asked you some other questions as well. So, are you exaggerating the attractiveness to international companies? Now, if you want to benefit SMEs, well, you should focus on that. But on the other hand, you are saying that you want to attract international consortia. So which way are you going? You have to make the policy clearer. So if the tax saved is just this amount, I don't think the effect is really that great. Now, Hong Kong's taxation regime has always been simple, and people don't really need a lawyer to calculate their tax. But now you have included all these definitions, control, entity. There are so many jargons. So on one hand, you are reducing tax, and on the other hand, you are making the taxation regime more complicated. And of course, lawyers would welcome that, because in many advanced countries, tax lawyers make the most money. And in this piece of legislation, I have already discovered a lot of areas where we can play with. Well, we can do a lot of tax planning, and maybe Mr. Kenneth Leung also welcomes that, because he would have more opportunities to provide services. So should you not make it so complicated? You should make it more simple and less rigid. There shouldn't be so many strange concepts, because a lot of people are very busy. They don't know how to calculate to save tax. Well, this is actually the Hong Kong spirit. So can you simplify it? Deputy Secretary, thank you for your 3 questions. First, public consultation. I think members may understand this. For this 2-tier regime, it originates from the CE's election manifesto. After she is elected, in her policy address, she made an announcement. We didn't do a public consultation, but after the announcement of the policy address last year, we heard a lot of views, and almost all of these views were positive. And when we met with chambers of commerce and members of the business sector, they all thought this is a good policy which should be launched as soon as possible. So for tax reduction, I think it's reasonable that is welcomed by the business sector. As for the second question, in our paper, we have mentioned this. After the implementation of the 2-tier regime, as Mr. Porche said, we mainly hope to help SMEs. As for gaining international publicity mileage, that is not our focus. Now, because Hong Kong has done this already anyway, so we can also promote it as one of Hong Kong's advantages, other than a simple and low taxation regime. We do not think this 2-tier regime can attract multinational companies to come to Hong Kong, but we can surely help startup companies and SMEs. And the third question. For the connected entities, we want to maintain the core of Hong Kong's taxation regime, that it is simple and is can be enforced easily. So a group of companies can nominate one company to receive the benefits. So this is simple, and we can strike a balance. This can also prevent abuse of the system. If one person has only one company as a sole proprietorship, it's very easy for him to fill in the tax return. He can tell the IRD that I'm only operating this company. I have no other subsidiaries. On the other hand, if it's a group, it has a lot of connected entities, then there must be professionals providing advice to the boss, and they will definitely know how to file their tax return. Well, of course, nobody would object to tax reduction. I also support that. Even though there's no objection, you still need to consult people as to how this should be done best. I hope you can have a public engagement. And about the design, Hong Kong has attached a lot of importance to commercial freedom. We are a common law jurisdiction, and companies are separate entities. This is a very important principle. Lately, some high-ranking officials have bought properties by using company names, but still, this is a very important principle. Well, if you use natural person, it's against the law, but if you use companies, you can still enjoy tax benefits. This is legal. So it's a matter of morals. So now you want to encourage SMEs and startups. I can understand that you want the business sector to be more vibrant. I welcome that. But now you are restricting people by all these complicated things, for example, connected entities, etc. But so this would be an obstacle for startups. So for an individual, there are a lot of restrictions. So he has to make a lot of calculations, and eventually, your policy will be counterproductive. So can you explain more? Mr. Chair is asking this question, and Starry Lee also asked another question. Now, under the present or under this new policy, if you buy a property in the name of a company, you can enjoy the tax reduction. So there may be a problem. Now we are talking about this two-tier regime. It has nothing to do with property buying. So for profits tax, they are mainly about companies that are operating their businesses. Mr. Poche asked if this regime is too complicated. Now there are a lot of requirements concerning and connected entities, and whether this would restrict the freedom of doing business. For a company, it should know very well about its shareholding position. So this is just a very simple requirement. In the future, tax return, he just has to make a choice. That is, he should nominate one of the companies within the group to enjoy the benefits. So the company has the initiative in his own hand. So without this connected entity restrictions, then there may be abnormalities. Now, for example, if there is a group and it owns 100 restaurants, now because it wants to enjoy all the benefits, maybe he can turn all these 100 restaurants into independent companies. So these 100 companies can all enjoy the first $200 million benefits. So we will have to consider this. If there are flaws in our system, would there be results that we have never expected? Maybe I'll let other members ask first. We still have time. Mr. Kenneth Leung. Thank you, Chairman. I have a simple question. Just now, Mr. Porcher asked about public consultation. So for this amendment of the law, I think it has been detailed in the CE's policy address, and a lot of public consultations have been conducted concerning the policy address. I have studied the bill, and yes, there are some words which are quite difficult. However, the policy direction is simple and the effect is simple. So I would like to ask the chairman, will our Bills Committee hold a public hearing? I think we should decide on that first, because if we are going to do that, we need to find a time slot. Okay, as the chairman, maybe I should discuss with members now. Just now, we've heard Mr. Porcher's view on public consultation, so I would like to ask members. Well, yes, of course, we can hold a public consultation, and we can do it in many ways. Can we hold a public hearing, or should we just receive written submissions? Then we can also know the views of the public. So there are two ways of doing it. Now, some may want a public hearing, and as Mr. Kenneth Leung said just now, this piece of legislation is quite simple and is pretty acceptable to most of people. So do you just want to receive submissions in writing?
So would members prefer written submissions sent to this panel? That would be a more appropriate arrangement. So what are your views on this, Mr. Porcher? So it's glad to hear from Kenneth Leung, but welcome this early passage of this bill. I worried there would be any time constraints, because I hope that we can start in the in this next assessment year. So I want to hear from the professional bodies, whether for public hearing or written submissions, we can do it concurrently. Let's see how interested in the public. If not, we don't need to hold a public hearing. So it's better to go through the motions anyway. So any other views? Mr. Hu Chi-wei. I think the topic nature itself is straightforward. So it's just probably the concern is the implementation details or potential issues. So inviting the professional bodies for their opinions to see whether we need to fine-tuning would be the best way to go. I don't quite see that looking. So I don't see any controversy in terms of policy direction. It's just about the implementation details. I think the expert looking at this will be interested in filing submissions. So within a suitable time, we can complete the written submissions. Of course, the whole process will need very much depends on the submissions we received before we can proceed. So then that members will not object to written submissions, and particularly the submissions from professional organizations, so can deal with this on the public consultation through the written submissions then. There might be members who want to ask more questions. Mr. Wu Chi-wei. I noticed that in the bill there's a section on the definition of connected entities. So here they mentioned about 50% of interest and so on. So for the actual operations, let's say it's siblings, everyone having 30-something%. So would that count or not? My line of thinking is that, so the Assistant Secretary mentioned that a group of companies, let's say for a convenience store operator, they could chop it up into a lot of companies to maximize their tax benefits. So what sort of risk would this company would face? Because there would be certain risks, let's say transaction costs and so on, that would stop the companies from doing that. And you claim that it would be risk-free and no transaction cost. Then they would have this kind of arrangement. I'm not familiar with this. Just I wonder, have you studied this? We hope to help the SMEs. However, I agree that impose a lot of administrative ordinance. Let's say we lost $5.4 billion in tax receipt, and yet we have to incur a few hundred million administrative expenses for checking, investigation, and so on. Probably may not be worthwhile. So how would it deal with this? So for the cost of administrative oversight. So let me respond to the second part of the question, while Mr. Chu can explain the interpretation for connected entities. How's our operation arrangements have taken into account the possible reactions in the business sector? So for the half tax rate election, it's about under $2 million. The maximum tax benefit at $160,000. Without other restraint, they would consider their own business need or do the math of the setup. The cost of setting up a company, I think, is smaller, below $160,000 for the business registration and annual filing and so on. There will be they take that as a small cost, so they can set up new companies to reduce the long-term tax burden. There will be more incentive. Currently, there's no such consideration because all the companies enjoy the same tax rate. That's why we think it's practical to have such requirement for the connected entities. Ms. Chu, for Mr. Wu Chiwai's question, I can offer further explanation. Let's say for connected entity, we draw the line. It have to be simple, straightforward, and easy to execute. So that's our presupposition. So it's a group of companies, whether for a cross-border or a local group companies, only one entity can enjoy this two-tier lower tax rate. When drawing the line, we think about a lot of the SMEs are usually family business. Let's say a father only 20% of the company, mother only 25%. The eldest, the second son made up for the other 25% each. Let's say one son had own another company, will not should have a whole unit, which is use a natural person. So we took account of the Hong Kong situation. So notice that the legal advisor raised it. Why asking to the concept employing a relative? That we had banning this. We using a natural person. If the natural person control more than one business or sole proprietorship, that will be considered a connected entity. So in other words, it's more like an honor system to make a declaration and for some simple checking to decide whether a company had deliberately avoid taxes. in the design of a filing tax returns form, the taxpayer has said clearly that it would check this the two-tier system that have no connected entities, or I have a connected entity but have no other connected entities electing for the preferential tax rate of making false declaration have legal consequences for the big corporations or group companies. For the high-risk cases in our system, we have the information. We'll definitely take a look. We'll consider random sampling to see if there any abuse of this two-tier system of let's say more than one connected entity and enjoying this lower tax rate, because there only should only be one. So the RD estimate how many additional power would be needed for the random sampling and checking. So we don't have any plans to add any manpower so far. So we have high compliance. I don't think we need to assign extra manpower. So we may need to upgrade the computer system. I know the legal advisor wishes to supplement. So on Mr. Wu's question, under existing Inland Revenue Ordinance as Section 14A, Item 4, there's a concept called associates. It's about the concept of relative. And my letter that in this bill, there's not do have such concept of relative. Have second round, Mr. Paul Chair. Responding to Mr. Wu's, I concur with him that a simple tax regime will not only be convenient for the public to understand and execute, that the public administration expenses will be benefiting governments. Well, I'm surprised that you have no estimate of the extra manpower resounded. So it's because for any new legislation, there's always someone to work out the best outcome for you. And then with a new regime to be, let's say we have a replica of MPF. So we have a oversight. There will be admin costs, and it will be put back that derived a lot high expenses below returns. And you see that make sure to chase about the U.S. have been reducing their administration expenses, reducing the concessions, and so on, so that we don't. But what you did, we're going to opposite direction. You have to have more manpower, making the tax regime more complicated, even though the goal is to reduce the tax burden and attract capital in Hong Kong to facilitate startup and SMEs. So for social equity's sake, then why would someone use our corporate? We have to break the corporate veil, because let's say a company tax evasion or to cut manpower cost or negligence acts, close one and start another one. In this regard, we agree that we'd have to make a compromise. However, just to for the sake of tax concession, that we should just destroy, we go behind the corporate veil, the who to benefit, and so on. This is not the usual practice in making Hong Kong a successful business environment. So either you can lead by the big business having so many restrictions, and yet you're going this way. So with the make it less competitive, I hope that you can clarify this. If not, that all such amendments will make you missing the big picture. So I'd like to ask what you really want to. If you want to encourage the SMEs, If they used to all start in companies, why don't you just allow this? How much money can you save anyway? If it's such high admin expenses, really saving over $100,000 or so, it doesn't make sense. It sounds like I'm making a concession for the SME and startups. However, you actually are creating additional administrative burden. And you haven't even come up with a method how many people would you need, and there'll be insufficient checking and alleged abuses. And then the high-ranking officials, and we just took part in that as well, and there'll be scandal breaking out. What are you going to do?
Deputy Secretary, thank you for your views. We will maintain our simple and low taxation regime. Now, with this two-tier proposal, we hope that when it comes to connected entities, the definition is also clear and simple in the law, and it's easy for the business sector to understand. As Mr. Chiu said, the ILD's tax return form is actually very simple. People do not have to fill in a lot of details. There is just one or two more things to fill in on the form. That is, whether this company is eligible for the two-tier regime or whether it's nominated by a certain group for the tax benefits. So this is basically an honor system. Just now the ILD told us that they are not going to increase manpower because we think this arrangement is well within the present regime. So, well, when the ILD vet tax returns, they would always conduct random check. Yes, I respect honor system, but do you remember this old lady who was mistakenly getting coupons from Manning and she's penalized? So if a person fill in wrong information on the tax return, would he also be penalized? I think there should also be declarations. Then that's what you mean, what you mean by an honor system. So if you are careless and you fill in the wrong information, then there will be criminal consequence. And when it comes to monitoring, how can you just brush aside? Now, even for the double stamp duties, etc., you have to increase manpower to do that. But now you are implementing a new policy, so you want it to be cost effective. I also put this question forward this morning. Now, for a group of, well, just now we've talked about an individual opening 15 companies, and all these companies are buying properties for investments. So according to this new system, they say that only one company will benefit from the tax reduction. But will anybody make use of the loopholes in the system? Well, the Deputy Secretary told us this morning that there will be random checks. And Mr. Porche is asking the same question. He also has the same concern. So, Deputy Secretary, can you explain to us more? Now, if you do random check, you need extra manpower, right? Or, as you said just now, you are not going to increase manpower at all? Mr. Chiu, thank you. Well, let me explain about the operation of the ILD. After getting tax returns, this is what we will normally do. For a tax return form, well, there is income, expenses, tax allowance, etc. So you would ask me whether some taxpayers are already abusing this system. Of course there are, but we want to minimize that. So when it comes to the compliance check, there are three ways of doing it. First, we will review after receiving a case. Now, if I look at the form and when I look at the relevant data on computer, there are discrepancies. For example, if that's an individual, then when I check on computer, I find that this person is actually the director of many companies. So I think we better double check whether there's any abuse. So this is just one example. So if we go more in depth, then we may need to talk to that person to try to find out more. Well, it doesn't mean that after you fill in a tax return form, you are criminally liable. Well, it may just be the person's omission. Maybe he's just careless. So if he has reasonable defense, then I don't think he's criminally liable. Now, of course, there are people trying to defraud. Then, of course, we really have to check further if there is a serious breach, and then we will consider what to do with it. Shouldn't we start any legal procedure against that person? We would have to look more carefully. So for this mechanism, it is not just restricted to connected entities. And if we find that certain entities are of higher risk, we would conduct a thematic review. In the past 3 years, if I find that this was a higher risk position, then we will initiate the thematic review. And after 3 years, if I find that there are not many breaches in this area, then the resources will be deployed to other areas. So resources deployment and updating the computer system are all very important work. So when it comes to manpower, you will have $5.8 billion less income. So how will you deploy your resources to handle that? I'll try to answer this question. Just now, the Deputy Secretary said that for this two-tier regime, we will have $5.8 billion less income. We will not have more or less work as a result, because the tax base has not been narrowed. The number of taxpayers is still the same. It's just the tax rate is changed. The number of tax returns has not changed either. Well, we will be getting less revenue from profits tax, but we cannot reduce our manpower as a result. But do we need to increase manpower? As I explained just now, at the IRD we already have an existing mechanism. Now, if we consider this carries a certain high risk, then we would enhance the reviews in this area. Any other questions? If not, I still have a question. Different members have asked questions about this reform. Some asked if the whole profits tax system will be changed and whether a progressive approach will be adopted. Some members say that, well, of course, this would convenience SMEs, but they hope that you can do a better monitoring job. Mr. Chiu told us that you would have enough manpower, and according to past experience, you think that you have the capability to handle this. So when it comes to actual implementation, if you discover that there are more companies abusing the system, then if there is a need to review the manpower situation, then you can come back to talk to us. Because we do not want this new policy to be abused. As for buying properties as an investment, I hope you have heard members' views. Well, buying properties and trying to make profits from incomes is a type of business which is entitled to the tax reduction. We want to benefit SMEs that are really operating a business. So I hope you would note members' views. Mr. Kenneth Leung. In the past few years, I have made a lot of views concerning stamp duty. That is, by buying properties through companies, you may evade the system. Now, with the harsh measures implemented, all companies need to pay 15% stamp duty when they buy properties. Now, if you want to enjoy the half-rate tax, you may want to buy a property with a company. In the past, people did use companies to buy properties, and they could save a lot of money. Of course, it's about a company holding a single property. So you can sell your company, and then your property can be sold. And by doing so, you can save stamp duty. But this is still a loophole, and I already mentioned this several years ago. I hope the government can plug this loophole. Mr. Paul Chair, now you impose a higher stamp duty on property buying through a company. I think if you want to stop all this, you might better scrap the company's ordinance. I think this system is very important. Companies should be legally entitled to buy properties. Now you want to target companies all the time, and you don't want to give them any benefits. Well, there are unscrupulous employers who want to evade their responsibilities. You should target them. And if that is the case, then of course you should tighten your measures. Of course, I'm overreacting because I think Hong Kong is a free economy and it encourages competitions. It shouldn't restrict companies so much. We have a company system in Hong Kong, and they should be protected by the law. But these are the competitive edges of Hong Kong. If you want to scrap all this, so what should Hong Kong rely on? We don't have resources. We don't have land. I want to talk about stamp duty. And a company holding a single property, and that has nothing to do with the company's ordinance. I don't know why Paul Che is saying that. I'm saying there's a single company and its own business is holding a Hong Kong residential property. And then we can just buy and sell the company to carry out a transaction of the property. And the tax is just 0.25, so it is a far cry from the hefty stamp duty. Now, this has been in existence for a long time. So it has nothing to do with what entity is doing what business. We are talking about a free economy here. Yes, your views are noted. The time is up for today's meeting. So let us talk about the arrangement for the next meeting. Now, first we will be inviting our professional bodies to give us written submissions. So at the next meeting, we will be looking at these written submissions. And also for the clause-by-clause examination, we hope that we can start it at the next meeting. AOB. If there's no AOB, we'll adjourn today's meeting. Thank you. Thank you.